The iron gates of the Wyoming State Penitentiary let out a dry, rusted screech, tearing through the still air of a chilly October morning. Cassian Cole stepped out, and the first lungful of freedom didn't taste nearly as sweet as he's imagined. It was bitter with road dust and cold enough to bite, like a warning. He paused, adjusting the worn duffel bag on his shoulder. Inside was his entire life: an old set of clothes, a rusty pocket knife, and the $100 reintegration fee handed to him by a stone-faced guard. 3 years. 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. 3 years for his calluses to shift from gripping reins to banging rocks in the workshop. Cassian looked down at his hands. They were mapped with new scars, but the memory of warm horsehide and the scent of prairie hay still ran deep in his veins. The Wyoming sky was leaden today, with heavy clouds hanging low over the distant limestone peaks. The wind whistled through the flimsy jacket he'd been issued. The high country Cole didn't give a damn about anyone, especially a man with empty pockets. Cassian started the long walk toward Riverton. He needed a bus ticket to get the hell out of here, anywhere where the name Cassian Cole didn't carry the stink of a man who'd sold out his ranch to help rustlers. But as he passed through the western outskirts, where rotting timber fences ringed dilapidated corrals, a sharp, foul stench hit him square in the face. It was the smell of blood and animal sweat mixed with rusted metal. The black market for canner horses appeared before him like a graveyard for the living. This was the end of the line for horses too old to plow, too weak to race, or too sick to be loved before being sent to the kill floor for pet food or glue. Amidst the crowd of rough-looking dealers and the shouting of the auction, Cassian stopped dead in his tracks. At the far end of the pens, separated by a rusted chain-link fence, stood a Mustang cross. He was so thin you could count every rib under his mangy ash-gray coat. His legs were shaking, and his head hung so low, his nose nearly touched the muck of manure and urine at his feet. "That one? Don't waste your breath," a pot-bellied man with a cheap cigarette dangling from his lips said as he approached Cassian. He was the yard boss. Name's Cinder. Fitting, ain't it? He's about ready to burn out. Got the lung fever. Can't catch a breath to save his life. I'm putting him under the knife this afternoon. Cassian didn't answer. He moved closer to the fence. The horse caught his movement and looked up. Those weren't the eyes of an animal that had given up. Deep in those tired, clouded pupils, Cassian saw a flicker of a spark of slow-burning spite that felt exactly like his own when he was tossed into a cell 3 years ago. "How much?" Cassian asked, his voice raspy from the cold wind. The yard boss smirked, blowing a cloud of gray smoke in his face. "You kidding? Meat prices are up. He's worth at least $1.50. I've only got 100, Cassian said, his hand tightening around the cash in his pocket. "And you're going to have to do the killing, the butchering, and the hauling. Give him to me for 95, and I'll take him off your hands right now. No work for you, no sweat, and you get whiskey money in your pocket today." The man paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Cassian's raggedy appearance. He recognized the cheap state-issued jacket of a fresh parolee. A cruel grin spread across his face. 95, only a damn fool would take that deal. But fine, he's half dead, anyway. Take the piece of junk somewhere else to die. Cassian pulled out the crumpled bills, smoothed them out, and set them on the filthy table. He had exactly $5 left, just enough for a loaf of bread and a small bottle of water. His dream of a bus ticket to another state vanished with every bill on that table. When Cassian entered the pen and reached out, the horse flinched, a painful wheeze echoing from his hollow chest. He tried to back away, but his legs gave out. Cassian quickly caught his head, not with force, but with a gentleness he'd learned from his cowboy father. "Easy now, Cinder." "I know," he whispered, pressing his forehead against the horse's. "They say you're trash. They said the same about me. But you and I aren't called for just yet." He used a scrap of rotting rope for a lead. Cinder stumbled behind him out of the yard. The horse dealers around them burst into laughter. One even tossed an empty tin can their way. "Look at that. A jailbird and a deadbeat horse. A match made in heaven." Cassian didn't look back. He led Cinder through Riverton, under the cold, disgusted stares of the locals. They recognized him, the black sheep of this land, the man who'd shamed the cowboy code. But Cassian didn't care. His mind was fixed on Cinder's rattling breath. With every step the horse took, Cassian felt a knot tighten in his own chest. The first snow started to fall, thin flakes that vanished the moment they hit the muddy ground. Cassian took off his thin jacket and draped it over the horse's back. Cinder gave a small shiver, looking at him with wide eyes, seemingly unable to grasp why this human was doing this. They kept going, leaving the warm lights of town behind, heading toward the rocky ridges to the north where an abandoned line shack Cassian knew from his youth sat waiting. It was a journey of over 10 miles, and in Cinder's condition, it was a death march. Every mile or so, Cinder would collapse. Cassian would kneel beside him, using his rough hands to massage the horse's trembling legs, whispering rambling stories about the green prairies he'd seen in his dreams. He tore his own shirt to wrap the bloody sores on the horse's legs, worn raw by long hours and chains. By the time total darkness fell, and the cold began to soak into his marrow, they reached the shack. It was a rotting timber structure with a few holes in the roof, but at least it had 3 walls to break the wind. Cassian led Cinder inside. The horse immediately collapsed onto a pile of moldy hay. Cassian panted, his own lungs burning from the frozen air. He pulled out his last $5, looked at it for a moment, and shoved it back in his pocket. He'd go hungry tonight. He gathered some dry kindling and started a small fire in the corner. In the flickering firelight, Cassian began to strip off the beat-up saddle the yard boss had thrown in for free. As he lifted the heavy, stiff, foul-smelling leather off Cinder's back, Cassian couldn't help but curse under his breath. The horse's back was covered in horrific pressure sores. Some spots had already turned necrotic. The yard boss had left this saddle on for weeks without taking it off, turning it into a tool of pure torture. "God damn it," he hissed, gently using melted snow to wash the wounds. Cinder gave a soft groan, resting his head on Cassian's lap. He looked at the battered saddle sitting in the shadows. It looked pathetic, peeling leather, cracked wooden tree. He dragged it over, set it on the soft dirt, and used it as a pillow. "Get some sleep, Cinder," Cassian said, his voice fading into the sound of the wind howling outside the shack. "Tomorrow we start our fight. You either pull through and become a warhorse again, or we both end up 6 feet under this Wyoming snow." Morning light filtered the gaps in the rotting roof, casting pale streaks across Cassian's gray face. He jolted awake at the sound of a heavy, hacking cough right beside him. Cinder was trying to haul himself up, but his legs shook like dry twigs in a gale before he collapsed back into the moldy hay. Cassian sat up, his joints popping. He reached into his duffel and pulled out the leftovers, a bit of salt and the rock-hard crust of bread he'd skipped for dinner last night. He broke off half, placed it in his palm, and held it to Cinder's nose. The horse sniffed for a moment, his cracked lips twitching, before slowly taking the first bite from his new master's hand. "I know it ain't much, but it's all we got right now," Cassian whispered. He stood up, stretching as he looked outside. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained, draped over the valley like an icy shroud. He knew time was running out. Cinder's lungs were full of fluid. Every breath sounded like the wheeze of an old bellows. Without treatment, he wouldn't last the week. Cassian dug through his memory for the herbal lore his father, an old-timer who'd spent his life in the saddle, had taught him. He remembered Osha root, a mountain herb found on northern rocky slopes, known to clear lungs and boost a horse's constitution. Cassian tucked his pocket knife into his belt, giving Cinder one last look before stepping out. "Stay put. Don't you go dying on me while I'm gone." He hiked for hours along treacherous ridges, his old boots soaked with slush until his feet went numb. Hunger started gnawing at his gut, but every time he thought of stopping, the image of Cinder's eyes spurred him on. Finally, under a wind-shattered rock shelf, he found the withered, feathery leaves of the Osha plant. He dug into the frozen earth with his bare hands, pulling up the gnarly roots that smelled of strong, spicy musk. Returning to the shack as the sun hit its peak, Cassian found Cinder still down, his breathing shallower and faster. He hurried to restart the fire, using a single tin cup scavenged from a junk pile to boil snow water, dropping in slices of the root. The herbal scent filled the cramped space. Once the tea cooled, Cassian lifted Cinder's head. Using a clean rag soaked in the brew, he squeezed it drop by drop into the horse's mouth. Cinder fought it at first, then began to swallow, as if his survival instinct kicked in, recognizing the medicine for what it was. Afterward, Cassian took the warm root mash, mixed it with a bit of animal fat found near the woods, and began massaging it into the horse's chest and neck. His rough hands moved in a steady rhythm, kneading the spasming muscles. He felt the heartbeat weak, but stubborn beneath the thin hide. Cinder let out a low moan, not from pain, but seemingly leaning into the care. Cassian didn't sleep that night. Every hour he massaged, brewed more tea, and whispered encouragement into the horse's ear. By the third day, a small miracle happened. Cinder could stand on his own without help. Though wobbly, he managed to walk out of the shack to drink from a nearby creek. Cassian watched him, a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. He started sharing a thin mash cooked from the last $5 he'd used to buy a bit of bran from a distant general store. Each day they took short walks around the shack to help the horse's lungs open up. The bond between them tightened. Cinder no longer flinched at Cassian's shadow. Instead, he dodged the man's shoulder whenever he sat on the porch. In the silence of the valley, two souls cast out by the world were finding strength in each other. However, a cold dose of reality soon hit. While grooming Cinder's coat, which was finally starting to show some sheen, Cassian's hand hit a row of strange scars along the inner thigh and flank. These weren't typical whip or chain marks. They were small, round, evenly spaced, the telltale signs of high-voltage cattle prods. Cassian froze. His heart raced. As a lifelong cowboy, he knew exactly what this meant. People use juice to force a horse past its limits, usually in illegal underground racing. He stepped back, taking a harder look at Cinder's build in the daylight. Despite the thinness, his pelvis was wide, his thighs long, and his hooves rock solid. His proportions were perfectly balanced traits of a pure Mustang crossed with a Middle Eastern endurance breed. Cinder wasn't just some stray. He was a high-stakes horse, stolen and run into the ground in underground circuits, then dumped when his lungs gave out from dust and abuse. That's when Cassian noticed a small faded tattoo under the left ear, the number 72 in a broken crown. "Goddamn," Cassian breathed, his breath hitching. "You're a Crown Ranch horse. You're Ghost, the one that went missing 2 years ago." That disappearance had been the talk of the high country. The Crown Ranch, owned by an old money family, had collapsed after their prize stallion vanished, allowing Baron Vance to move in and gobble up their land. Cassian realized he was sitting on a ticking time bomb. Owning Cinder, if found, wouldn't just get him pegged for rustling again, it would put a target on both their backs for the men who'd orchestrated the theft to cover their tracks. That night, the wind howled through the canyon louder than usual, signaling a storm. Cassian sat by the fire, fingering his pocket knife. His gaze drifted to beat-up saddle in the corner, his pillow for the last few nights. He recalled the yard boss words. "Fitting name, ain't it?" He's about ready to burn out. Why would a shrewd horse trader sell a hot animal like this to a fresh parolee for dirt cheap? Maybe he wanted the living evidence gone as fast as possible. Cassian stood up and walked over to the saddle. He picked it up, feeling a strange weight to it. The outer leather was rotted, but the tree felt unusually solid. He figured he'd strip it down tomorrow to see what he could salvage, or at least stitch it up for a more comfortable seat. His thoughts were cut short by the roar of a truck engine in the distance. Headlights swept through the dead trees, aiming straight for the shack. Cinder let out a terrified whinny, pacing in place. Cassian smothered the fire with a handful of snow, plunging everything into darkness. He grabbed Cinder's lead, pulling him into the deepest corner of the shack. His heart hammered. He knew no one came out this way unless they were looking for something or someone. The truck skid to a halt in the yard. A door slammed with a heavy thud. "I know you're in there, Cole." A deep, gravelly voice boomed through the thin wood. "Don't make us burn the place down to flush you out." It was Bartholomew Creel Baron Vance, top enforcer. Cassian gripped the lead, feeling Cinder's warmth and tremors beside him. The past he'd tried to outrun had caught up faster than he'd feared, bringing the stench of betrayal from the very men who'd put him behind bars. The darkness in the shack grew thick, filled only with the heavy thud of Cassian's heart, and Cinder's ragged breathing. Outside, the truck's headlights pierced through the gaps in the timber planks, turning the interior into a striped cage of light and shadow. Cassian reached for a wooden club as thick as a man's wrist, leaning against the wall. He didn't have a gun. For a man on parole, packing heat was a one-way ticket back to a cell. But he wasn't about to let anyone walk in here without paying the price. "You're making this hard on us, Cassian." The rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen dirt grew louder. Creel was closing in. "We just want to make sure you're taking good care of the boss's property." Cassian's jaw tightened. Property. The word felt like a slap in the face. He nudged Cinder further into the corner, where the shadows of the rafters masked the horse ash-gray coat. "I don't have a damn thing belonging to Vance," Cassian growled from inside, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "Get lost before I call the law for trespassing." A raucous laugh erupted from outside. "The law? In this valley, Vance is the law. Now, open up." The rotting wooden door was kicked off its hinges, slamming against the wall. The blinding glare of a high-powered flashlight hit Cassian square in the eyes. He squinted, shielding his face, but stood his ground in front of the horse. Creel stepped inside, flanked by two meat-headed thugs. He lowered the beam, letting it settle on Cinder's gaunt frame. "Well, look at that," Creel whistled with mock surprise. "The kill pen special is actually standing? You got a magic touch, Cole." "He's mine. I paid for him fair and square," Cassian said, stepping forward, his grip tightening on the club. "Paid? To who?" "Some border-running bottom feeder?" Creel smirked, moving closer. "The boss has a report of a stolen horse with these exact markings. A Mustang Cross, brand number 72. I bet if I flip that ear I find exactly what I'm looking for." Cinder let out a terrified whinny, tossing his head as Creel reached out. Cassian swung the club instantly, blocking the henchman's path. The air became so thick with tension that a single spark could have set the whole place off. "Don't touch him, Cassian," Cassian hissed. Creel backed off, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You're still as bullheaded as you were 3 years ago. That's exactly what landed you in the big house. You think you're a hero? You're just a two-bit thief holding onto hot goods." Just then, a second vehicle pulled up, a sleek, black luxury SUV that looked out of place in the desolate valley. The door opened, and a middle-aged man stepped out. He wore a high-dollar sheepskin coat and a pristine white Stetson Baron Vance. Vance didn't step into the filthy shack. He stood outside, framed by his own headlights like a man draped in power. "That's enough, Creel," Vance said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Cole, I didn't come here to haggle over a few $100 of horse meat. I came to give you an out." Cassian stepped out of the shadows to the broken threshold. He looked directly at the man who had gutted his family and snatched his father's ranch while he was behind bars. "Your outs always lead to a cliff's edge, Vance." Vance smiled, a cold, empty expression. "Still got that ego. Listen, word's getting around town that you've raised a ghost horse from the dead. Independence Day is coming up, and I'm hosting a race through Devil's Canyon. The purse is $50,000 cash, and more importantly to you, legal title to whatever animal you ride, plus a letter clearing your jacket of any priors in this county." Cassian went still. 50 grand was a fortune, but it was the second condition that got to him. With legal title, no one could touch Cinder. With a clean record, he could actually start over. "And if I lose?" Cassian asked. "Then you sign a confession for stealing ranch property. You'll go back to the pen for a hell of a lot longer than 3 years. And this horse," Vance glanced at Cinder in the shadows. "He comes home to me. I'll finish what the slaughterhouse started." "Don't listen to him, Cass," a young voice called out from the brush. A teenager about 16, wearing an oversized coat, ran out. It was Toby, Cassian's distant cousin, the only soul in town who still checked on him. "Go home, Toby," Vance barked, making the boy flinch. Vance turned back to Cassian. "Well, Cole, do you believe in yourself? Or are you only good at hiding in a shanty with a piece of crap nag?" Cassian looked back at Cinder. The horse seemed to be watching him. He wasn't shaking anymore. He stood square on all fours, ears pricked, waiting. For a heartbeat, Cassian didn't see a sick animal. He saw the shadow of the legendary ghost, his father's honor, and the future he craved. Devil's Canyon is a death trap, Cassian said coldly. No one rides that trail without catching hell. That's why it's got your name on it, Vance shrugged. 1 week, at your father's old gate. Don't be late. Vance turned and climbed back into the SUV. Creel and the thugs retreated, though Creel threw one last threatening look over his shoulder. The SUV roared off, leaving a cloud of dust and a crushing silence. Toby ran over, out of breath. "You're crazy, Cass!" Vance has his best stock ready. He's got Arab crosses that run like the wind. Cinder, he can't win that. Fast ain't everything in the canyon, Toby, Cassian said, stroking Cinder's nose. He could feel the horse's temperature had leveled out. Out there, you need grit, trust, and a little bit of crazy. Over the next few days, the shack became a secret training camp. Cassian knew he was being watched, so he never worked Cinder during the day. Only when night fell and the fog rolled in did he lead the horse out. He didn't start with sprints. Instead, he led Cinder on hours-long treks up steep rocky slopes, strapping small sandbags to the horse's chest to build muscle. He used his knowledge of the land to teach Cinder how to find his footing on slick limestone. Their bond shifted from rescue to kinship. Cassian learned to read every flick of Cinder's ears, every snort that signaled danger. In return, Cinder learned to trust Cassian's hands and voice completely. The lung cough still flared up, but Cassian had the Osha root. He brewed it every night, mixing it into the feed, and using the herbal water to sponge the horse down. Cassian's logic was simple. Vance's horses were pampered. They were fast but fragile. Cinder had walked through the valley of death. He knew cold, hunger, and pain. If there was a place where sheer will mattered more than speed, it was Devil's Canyon. Late one night during training, as Cinder rested by the creek, Cassian sat beside him, leaning against the battered saddle he always carried. He idly used his pocket knife to pry at a loose piece of leather on the side of the seat. The stiff, dried skin peeled back, revealing a wooden lining that didn't look like the rest of the frame. He frowned, leaning in for a closer look, when a dry branch snapped in the thicket behind them. Cinder's mane stood up instantly, and a low rumble started in his throat. Cassian killed his light and crouched below. Someone was tailing them. The silence of the night was no longer a friend. It was a hiding place for Vance's prying eyes. He gripped the reins and whispered, "Not yet, Cinder. We've got to keep this under wraps just a little longer." The Independence Day morning mist was as thick as a white shroud, draping the valley in a ghostly haze. At the gates of the old Cole family ranch, now bearing Baron Vance's name, the air was heavy with the smell of diesel from polished SUVs, the pungent musk of horse sweat, and the electric tension of hundreds of curious locals gathered for the strangest race in Wyoming history. Cassian stood at the edge of the crowd, his hand white-knuckled on Cinder's lead. The horse had changed so much he was unrecognizable. His ash-gray coat now gleamed from the herbal washes, and the muscles in his haunches rippled under his hide like steel cables. Cassian wore only a weathered leather jacket, battered boots, and that same beat-to-hell saddle he refused to trade, even after Toby tried to lend him a new one. "Well, looky here, the prince of the junk pile has arrived," one of Vance's riders mocked. He sat atop a purebred Arabian, snow-white with long, elegant legs and a haughty toss of its head. Vance stepped off the porch, a gold-plated stopwatch in hand. He eyed Cassian, his gaze sweeping over the horse before settling on the old saddle. A flash of pure disdain crossed his face. "Still insist on riding that antique Cole? Don't go blaming the gear when you break your neck in the canyon. Worry about your greenhouse ponies, Vance," Cassian shot back, his voice ice-cold as he swung easefully into the saddle. The starter pistol cracked, tearing through the fog. 7 horses shot off like arrows. Instantly, Vance's 3 stallions surged ahead, leaving Cassian and Cinder in the dust. The crowd roared as a cloud of grit swallowed the riders heading into the canyon mouth. Cassian didn't rush. He kept Cinder at a steady, rhythmic canter, his head low, whispering into the horse's ear, "Save it, Cinder. This race don't truly start till the sun's high." Devil's Canyon opened up like a jagged wound in the earth, with towering crimson cliffs and a trail barely wide enough for 2 horses, littered with boulders and hairpin turns. As they pushed deeper, the grade turned steep. The Arabians began to huff, their pace visibly flagging as their hooves skidded on the slick shale. At mile 5, Cashin let him out. Cinder moved with a strange, uncanny grace. He didn't just run in a straight line, but picked the sturdiest footings on the rock, the raw instinct of the wild Mustang rising to the surface. They blew past the first competitor, who was sidelined with a blown hoof. Suddenly, a massive boom echoed from the high cliffs. Boulders the size of a man's head rained down onto the trail directly in front of Cassian. Cinder screeched, rearing up on his hind legs. Cassian gripped the mane, pulling off a miracle of balance. He looked up and caught a glimpse of a dark-coated figure vanishing into the pines. "Playing dirty, Vance," Cassian hissed. He didn't look back, giving Cinder a sharp nudge. The horse cleared the debris in a single leap, his stride now fueled by pure spite. A dead man's scythe, the most treacherous turn, with a 45-degree drop straight into the abyss. Cassian saw Creel. He was stationed by his white horse, but he wasn't racing. He held a long bullwhip tipped with jagged metal. "You ain't making it past here, Cole." Creel swung the lash. The whip hissed through the air, catching Cinder across the flank. The horse bucked, a violent, hacking cough erupting from his chest. Blood began to seep from the fresh wound, mixing with the thick sweat. Cinder stumbled, his hind leg teetering on the brink of the cliff. "Come on, Cinder, don't you look down," Cassian yelled, dropping the reins and putting his life entirely in the animal's hands. In that life-or-death heartbeat, Cinder did something no one expected. Instead of collapsing from his usual lung heave, he took a breath so deep his chest reached its absolute limit. He spat out a dark, clotted lump of blood, the final blockage in his lungs. His eyes burned a fierce red. He didn't just run, he hit the gas. He slammed shoulder first into Creel's horse, sending the man and his high-priced mount crashing into the inner rock wall. Cassian didn't bother looking back. He felt the power surging to the saddle, a vibration, both massive and relentless. High noon hit just as the canyon exit appeared in the distance. Cassian could see the lead Vance horse flagging, white foam at its mouth, the rider whipping it into a frenzy. "Now," Cassian commanded. Cinder exploded. The sound of his hooves hitting the earth was like a war drum. Every stride grew longer, stronger, leaving every rival in the dust. As they tore out of the canyon and toward the finish line at the town square, thousands of people fell into a stunned silence. They didn't see a sick animal. They saw an ash-gray ghost flying through the golden sunlight, as majestic as a god of the plains. Cassian crossed the line 5 minutes ahead of the pack. He dismounted, his body spent but his eyes blazing. He didn't celebrate. First thing he did was strip off his jacket and drape it over Cinder, who stood blowing hard, white foam on his muzzle. Vance marched over, his face purple with rage and shock. "What the hell is this? That horse shouldn't be." "He did it, Vance. And now he's mine. Legally." Cassian pulled the signed agreement from his pocket and held it high for the crowd. "And you owe me a clean slate and the prize money." To the thunderous cheers of the locals who had been ground under Vance's heel for years, Cassian led Cinder away. He didn't go back to the shack. He headed for his old blacksmith shop, where he could truly tend to the horse's wounds. That night, by the dim light of an oil lamp, Cassian checked over his partner. He cleaned the blood from Cinder's flank and applied the best salve he could find. Then he turned to the saddle. The brutal race had torn the outer leather to shreds. At the wooden frame, where it had slammed against the rock avoiding Creel, a piece of rot had fallen away, revealing a hollowed-out compartment. Cassian narrowed his eyes, using his pocketknife to carefully pry back the remaining lining. His heart hammered as he saw a metallic glint. He pulled out a small tin box, rusted but sealed tight with beeswax. Inside was a roll of old parchment and a silver badge from the Vaughn family, the true owners of the Crown Ranch. Cassian opened the paper, his hands shaking. It wasn't a treasure map. It was the original will and the proof that Baron Vance had forged the debt papers to strong-arm the land 10 years ago. At the bottom of the will, a handwritten note, in faded ink, remained clear. "To whoever brings the ghost horse back to life, justice never sleeps. It only waits for a heart brave enough to wake it. This land belongs to the one who loves it, not the one who steals it." Cassian sank onto the hay, clutching the parchment to his chest. He looked over at Cinder. The horse was calmly chewing his grain, watching him with a look of pure understanding. The secret he'd been sleeping on for months wasn't gold. It was the salvation of the entire county. "You brought me back more than just a win, Cinder," he whispered. The dawn after the race didn't bring cheers, but a menacing silence that settled over the old blacksmith shop. Cassian had stayed up all night, his fingers still smelling of the rusted tin box and the old leather of the saddle. Alistair Vaughan's will lay flat on the wooden table, the ink seemingly burning under the glow of the dying oil lamp. He knew Vance wouldn't sit idly by waiting for the state troopers to knock on his door. In this country, where the line between the law and the business end of a barrel was thin, that piece of evidence in his hand was a death warrant for whoever held it. The rhythmic clip-clop of hooves in the distance cut through Cassian's thoughts. He quickly tucked the will into the lining of his leather jacket, slid his pocket knife into his belt, and stepped outside. Cinder let out a low, warning nicker, his ears swiveling toward the trail leading to the shop. But it wasn't Vance hired guns who appeared. It was a group of local farmers led by old Miller the blacksmith and Toby. They rode on rugged workhorses, their faces etched with the deep lines of worry, but their eyes held a spark of hope Cassian hadn't seen before. "They're coming, Cass," Miller said, his voice gravelly. "Vance is claiming the race was rigged. Says you drugged the horse, and he's bringing men to recover his property." Cassian looked at the men standing before him. These were the men Vance had robbed of their grazing land, the men who had lived under high-interest seed loans and looks of contempt for decades. "I don't want to pull you all into this," Cassian said, stroking Cinder's mane. "This is my fight." "No, son," Miller said, dismounting and placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "When you crossed that line at Devil's Canyon yesterday, it stopped being just your fight. You showed us that a horse headed for the kill pin could take down million-dollar stallions. You woke up the backbone of this county." Cassian pulled the will out, holding it high. "This is the real reason they're coming. Vance took the Crown Ranch on a lie. This is the only legal proof left." A silence fell over the crowd for a heartbeat, then a slow-burning wave of fury began to spread. They didn't need any more convincing. An hour later, Vance's convoy rolled in. 3 black SUVs tore through the mist, stopping in the wide yard of the shop. Vance stepped out, but this time he lacked the calm of a gentleman. Behind him was Creel, his face a mess of bandages, and 6 bounty hunters carrying rifles. "And over that paper coal," Vance shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "And that horse, you aren't getting a fairy tale ending." Cassian walked to the center of the yard, standing alone beside Cinder. "You want this, Vance. Come get it in front of every man you bled dry." From behind the shop and the surrounding brush, over 30 farmers stepped out. They didn't have fancy rifles, only hoes, shovels, and cattle prods, but they formed a solid wall of men surrounding Cassian. Vance froze. His eyes scanned the mud-stained but resolute faces. He realized he could kill a man, but he couldn't kill a truth that had already broken cover. "What are you people doing? An uprising?" Vance sneered, signaling his men to chamber their rounds. "It ain't an uprising," Cassian said, his voice booming with authority. "We're taking back what's ours. The state troopers are on their way with the Vaughn family lawyer I contacted last night. You can open fire right now, but you'll never scrub away the blood." The wail of police sirens drifted in from the distance, shattering the tension. That was the clincher. Vance looked around, seeing only his own isolation in the face of righteousness. Creel, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly backed away, leaving his boss out to dry. The legal battle dragged on for over a year, but with the original will and the united front of Riverton's people, Baron Vance was stripped of his land and sent to the big house for fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Cassian Cole didn't become an overnight millionaire. He sold a small portion of the prize money and a few keepsakes from the tin box to clear his father's old debts and bought a piece of prime bottomland at the edge of the valley. He didn't build a mansion. Instead, he built a modest ranch called Cinder's Rest. Years later, his ranch became a sanctuary for abandoned horses, abused Mustangs, and young men just out of juvenile hall who had lost their way. Cassian taught them how to heal horses with herbs, how to listen to the breath of wounded creatures, and above all, he taught them that life doesn't end when people call you burnt out. One bright summer afternoon, As the sunlight turned the green pastures to gold, a scrawny teenager carrying a duffel bag walked through the ranch gates. He saw Cassian grooming an old, majestic horse with an ash-gray coat flecked with silver. "Mister, I heard you help folks with—" "Nowhere left to go," the boy stammered. Cassian stopped, looking into the boy's terrified but determined eyes that looked exactly like his own the day he left the prison gates. He patted Cinder's back and nodded at the boy. "You believe you can turn something rotted into pure gold?" Cassian asked. The boy looked confused. I don't know, sir." Cassian smiled, a look of pure peace. "Then start by taking off this saddle. And don't you ever go so fast that you forget to listen to his breath." In the distance, Cinder let out a whinny that echoed across the valley, like a welcome to a new journey. The old saddle from years ago now hung prominently in Cassian's living room, not as an antique, but as a reminder. The greatest treasures aren't found by luck, but are earned with bloody hands and a heart that never knows how to quit.